there, my name is Ron Rogers, and this presentation is titled An Old Type of Aviation Accident with Modern Twists. Now, this is it's a very interesting accident. This was occurred on 14 August of 2013, a controlled flight in terrain accident due to pilot error and pilot fatigue. It's an Airbus A300 aircraft that was involved in this accident. And the flight was originally from Louisville, Kentucky to Birmingham, Alabama. They started out the day in Rockford, and they had a number of stops. So it was the end of a long day or a long night. And of course, UPS has a different type of flying. You know, if you're trying to lead a normal life like the rest of the world, and your family is trying to lead a normal life like the rest of the world, getting sleep can be a difficult proposition. And, but I've had some guys tell me that they never had to throw a box off the airplane for abusive behavior. So, yeah, there is that advantage. But the interesting thing about it is the old Civil Aeronautics Board accident reports, that'd be 30, 40 pages. This accident report is 170 pages, and it goes into detail. And you want to know some issues to watch out with your iPhone and your iPad? Boy, did this bring some issues to light that a degree of monitoring that people may not have necessarily thought kind of existed at the time. Now, this is the A300. This is the actual UPS aircraft. And the captain of this aircraft was a Captain Beal. He's 58 years old. He had first been hired by TWA, and we know how that worked out in the time frame. He was a flight engineer on the 727, then a first officer, and then he ended up being hired by UPS in 1990. And went back as a flight engineer on the 27 and then as a co-pilot. He didn't have the best training record. He tried to upgrade a couple of times and had to withdraw from training. He had some issues. They didn't retain the training records, so a lot isn't necessarily known, but supposedly he had a lot of trouble with non-precision approaches. And this is kind of what this fell into. And it's kind of interesting. He was 58 years old. He had a total flight time of 6,406 hours, which is awfully low for somebody who's 58 and an airline pilot. But he had 3,265 in the A300, so he was an experienced A300 pilot. The first officer, Shanna Fanning, she began flying back in June of 2012, the A300, and she had 4,721 hours with 403 hours on the A300, and she was 37 years old. Now, here is the Birmingham Airport. That's where they're going, and I flew in there many, many times. And you know, these guys are flying on the backside of the power curve, and they're fatigued. And I flew the last 13 years internationally. So you're going east, you're going west. You don't know what time it is. You're always messed up. And it was actually 6 months after I had retired before I finally realized that I wasn't tired all the time, which is kind of an interesting thing. But I noticed that I actually did better. It taught me. That kind of flying taught me that I actually could fly fairly well when I was half asleep. I got some of my best landings, if you'd believe this, at 4:30 in the morning, my body time on my flight from Chicago to Beijing. I would be landing at 4:30 in the morning, and I think the fact that I was tired, I didn't fly the aircraft. I didn't overthink it. When I'm more awake, I think I put more effort in. I don't do as well. In fact, I had a couple of flight attendants on a couple of flights comment me, and when the flight attendants praise your landing, you know you're doing something right. One said that, and it was a very smooth landing. I got lucky. She said that she didn't realize we had touched down, but she just noticed we were going slower and slower, and finally we departed the runway on the taxiway. Of course, that's the way to do it. We departed the runway and went on over to the gate, so it kind of surprised her. But anyway, I digress. Here we are back at the Birmingham Airport. Now, the long runway there is 624. and that's the one you want to land on. Well, they're coming in the middle of the night, and this runway was closed between 4 and 5 in the morning, and they were supposed to land at 4:51. Now, there were a lot of aspects on the planning of this flight that didn't go very well, and there's issues with communication between the dispatcher and the pilots. A couple of the primary issues were the airport was VFR. It had a 1,000-foot ceiling, but in the surrounding areas, they had a bunch of lower ceilings down as low as 300 feet. And that's quite an issue there. Now, the other thing is, and this information was not relayed to the crew, so they didn't really know this. And they also were not aware, you should read the NOTAMs, but we had a little issue with O'Hare. The NOTAMs would be like 20 pages long, and you got to carefully check them, and that's why it's nice to have a big crew, so you can dedicate one person to spend 10 minutes checking the NOTAMs. But the dispatcher should have been aware of this, and he should have briefed it to the pilots, and the pilots should have been aware of it also, that they had the runway closure. So instead of getting a nice ILS to 2-4, which is the typical nice approach and landing that we typically do, they had to kind of scurry at the last minute because they didn't know until they arrived at the airport that they were going to have to shoot a non-precision approach to runway 18, the shorter runway. All right, so they're kind of behind the power curve in that respect, and the dispatcher could have helped them out a bit there, but that didn't happen. So let's look at the approaches. We have a couple approaches to runway 18. We have the RNAV and we have the localizer. Now, a localizer is a non-precision approach, as it were. You've got good lateral guidance like you want on ILS, obviously, but you don't have the vertical guidance. And this approach also has a step-down fix in it due to the higher terrain. Now, part of the whole problem they had with this situation, with this approach, was that in the process of figuring out, hey, we have to shoot this approach, we have to load it in the box and that, they left a discontinuity in the FMS or the FMC, Flight Management System, Flight Management Computer. Now, the problem with a discontinuity, if you're not familiar with that, is you go from one point in space and all of a sudden the airplane's supposed to get to the other point, which is the approach, and it doesn't know how to get there. And you confuse all these electrons and the ones and zeros, and it kind of messes up their minds. If you properly sequence it, and that was what the co-pilot was supposed to do, and she was negligent in that. And in this whole thing, as part of the accident, is fatigue. The captain complained that the schedules were killing him, and the first officer was cited, and I'll read that in the final conclusions here, of not getting adequate sleep. And I'll tell you how they determine that too, which is something, if you're an airline pilot or getting involved in one of these situations, you need to be aware of, because Big Brother is definitely able to watch what you're doing. So part of the problem was they didn't get the box properly sequenced. The box didn't know kind of where it was or quite how to sequence things. So they have a visual path indicator that is kind of like the ILS marker. I've got this on my Cessna 310. It will give me a quasi vertical guidance. It's almost as good as an ILS. I mean, not technically and all that stuff, okay. But it will fly me down a non-precision approach to a very nice centerline landing using the GPS data onto the runways out here. In fact, it's kind of how I told my wife, if I ever pass out, she can hopefully program the system to land it, and basically if she just pulls the power, she'll survive. But okay, they were supposed to set this up, but the FMC didn't know where it was, so it pegged the thing way high. So it showed them very much under the glide path the entire time. They never had good vertical descent guidance. And in the olden days, we had these dive and drive approaches, and I'll show that on the next little slide here. Now, this is a depiction of the dive and drive. Now, one thing interesting about this accident is the FOQA data, the Flight Operations Quality Assurance data, pointed out that air traffic control tended to bring you in high on this approach, and the captain was aware of it. It was kind of a a known gotcha. They tended to bring you in high, so he was ready for that. And you can see from the red line there the depiction of their flight path, and you can see the altitudes that they were supposed to be at. And on the final segment there, you notice the red line is above the dash blue line. He leveled off 200 feet high, which certainly didn't help him. And he had briefed using an approach, a vertical coupled approach that would use the aircraft computed vertical descent angle to actually fly it down like an ILS. But he was below the depiction, although he was above the 3.28 degree glide path. So what happened here is he's coming in on the approach. He realizes it's not going to follow the vertical guidance, and he reverts to vertical speed. Now, that was an issue here, and it had been so much greater if they'd just waited 9 minutes and shot the ILS. But the issue here was all of a sudden he's not shooting the approach that he had briefed. He didn't really convey it to the co-pilot what he was doing here, but he went from a vertical path guidance approach, which would have brought him down nicely, to what we call the dive and drive, because you dive down to the minimum descent altitude, or in this case, you've got even a step down fix. So you drive down to that, and then you drive down to the descent, minimum descent angle, and then you drive forward level until you get what is either a depicted visual descent point or one that you calculated. And back when I was in the Air Force, we had to calculate these, because especially when you're coming in a T-38 on a Category E approach, and probably some of you are out there going, what the heck is a Category E? That's a secret military approach. No, it's just an approach for high-speed aircraft, and you don't typically see it, because you don't typically see it at most civilian airports. It's you'll find it on the military approach charts. But again, I digress. So anyway, he got into this vertical descent rate. He's coming down at 1,500 feet per minute, and he's getting behind the aircraft. He's high, and he's behind, and he's diving, and he's doing an approach that he hasn't quite briefed. The aircraft had the capability of calling out 1,000 feet above the terrain, 1,000 feet, 500 feet, but they had disabled that. That's a very nice thing, because the airplanes I flew, the 777, it'll give you 1,000 feet, and then you have certain callouts. And 500 feet, you're supposed to be stabilized, landing configuration, all that stuff at 500 feet. Well, those callouts weren't made. The first officer who was supposed to be making those callouts didn't make it. She's supposed to be inside watching the instruments, and I don't know how hard this is, because I did this as a co-pilot and as a line check airman where I'm playing co-pilot. I'm supposed to be watching the instruments while the other guy's flying, and he's taking a peek outside to see if he can pick up the runway. But I'm on the instruments as the first officer, or playing first officer, to make sure that we're meeting all the parameters, and I'm looking at approaching minimums and stuff like that. Well, all that wasn't done. She was faulted for looking outside, not correctly communicating that information, and they punched right through the minimum descent altitude. Now, when I was working as chairman of the new aircraft committee from the Airline Pilots Association, Boeing did a presentation, and they talked about the accidents, the CFIT, controlled flight into terrain accidents, that were a dive and drive type of accident, where they dived and they didn't undive, and they just drove right into the ground. And he said, well, the solution is to move the runway 1.4 miles closer, because that was kind of the impact point. And yeah, that was very humorous, but it's not going to help you if you hit the ground or the runway at 1,500 feet, even if you move it closer. And they had the enhanced ground prox warning system, and you think this would have helped them out, but they had a software update that wasn't installed. They had the older update, and it gave them, at 250 feet above the ground, it gave them a sync rate command. Now, the procedures were, if you were in the weather and you got that command, and you didn't have the runway in sight, you were to go around. In fact, do a controlled flight into terrain recovery, where you pull up to 20 degrees pitch attitude, you shove the power in, and you do escape maneuver. And they felt that he might have had a chance of recovering the first time if he had gotten that, but on the software update, he'd have had a little bit over 6 seconds of warning on that. but instead he was going down at 1,500 feet per minute. He went past 250 feet altitude. Now the ceiling was about 300 feet. He calls out that he sees the runway, but of course one of the problems at night is, especially when you're kind of in a dark terrain, and I'll show you that picture in a second. When you're in dark terrain, you don't have a good view of actually how high you are, and that was part of the problem. So they're going through at 1,500 feet. He got the descent rate call out. 8 seconds later, they hit the tree, and then they got the 1 second after they hit the tree, they got the warning that they were too low terrain. So that's a really good system. But part of the problem with the even the enhanced ground proximity warning system and the terrain avoidance system is that when you're in landing configuration and you're coming in, you're going to land, you can't get a warning that says, terrain, go around. So it has to be kind of dumbed down so it doesn't give you false warnings. But in this situation, it worked to the disadvantage of the crew. And here we have where they hit the trees, went across the highway there, then they made ground contact, and the airplane started to come apart on them. And there's a picture of the front section, ending front section, and the cockpit is actually remarkably intact. And you almost think this almost looked like it was halfway survivable, and probably if they hadn't hit the ground at 1,500 feet per minute and all that stuff, they might have survived. Now, here's the thing that is really a gotcha. Okay, they were complaining of fatigue. And the NTSB went back. They interviewed the wives and the husbands and the families and what was the day like, and they made this chart. But they could also tell when the people were supposedly in crew rest, but they were on their cell phones or they were on their iPads. So obviously when you're on your iPad or your cell phone, you're not resting. So your little electronic device is snitching on you. So that's an interesting aspect that they know more about you and your sleep or awake habits than you might think. And they criticize the first officer for not getting adequate sleep, not calling in and complaining or putting herself on a fatigue call that, hey, I'm too fatigued. I need to be off this airplane. I don't need to be flying. And of course, it resulted in an impact early morning, short of the runway, and this is a picture picked up by a security camera. Now, the NTSB in their 170-page report, and you talk about a thorough report. I mean, in the olden days, you're talking about a 727 accident. Well, it's pretty basic. The equipment is basic. The avionics is very basic. A lot of times they didn't have ground prox warning systems. There was no TCAS. A lot of these systems didn't exist, and it was a lot simpler of an investigation. This one, with the flight management computers, the sequencing, and the enhanced ground prox warning system, all made a much more involved report. And I'll tell you, that is an extremely thorough report. The NTSB really does a good job. And of course, the safety record is a lot better now than it used to be. There are a lot fewer accidents now, and that's because we've got a lot more safety enhancements in a lot of ways that just help us not to have this sort of situation. But the unfortunate thing is they were shooting an approach that you don't shoot very often. And I mean, the only time I would typically see a non-precision approach, where you have a dive or drive, which would have been, but you have a vertical path descent indicator, that's in the check right in the simulator. That's about the only time you see it, because you're either flying day approaches with an ILS backup, or you're flying an ILS approach, or you're shooting a Cat 3 approach, which is a very well-briefed and well-practiced approach. So you just don't see these type of approaches, and the unfortunate thing, that was kind of the captain's weakness here, and so it wasn't helping out. And of course, the fatigued co-pilot not giving good call-outs in the altitudes certainly was a contributing factor. And from the NTSB, The probable cause, the NTSB determines that the probable cause of this accident was the flight crew's continuation of an unstabilized approach and their failure to monitor the aircraft's altitude during the approach, which led to an inadvertent descent below the minimum approach altitude and subsequently into terrain. Contributing to the accident were 1. The flight crew's failure to properly configure and verify flight management computers for the profile approach, the captain's failure to communicate his intentions to the first officer once it became apparent that the vertical profile was not captured, 3. The flight crew's expectation that they would break out of the clouds at 1,000 feet above the ground due to incomplete weather information, 4. The first officer's failure to make the required minimum callouts, 5. The captain's performance deficiencies, likely due to factors including, but not limited to, fatigue, distraction, or confusion, consistent with performance deficiencies exhibited during training, and 6. The first officer's fatigue due to acute sleep loss resulting from her ineffective off-duty time management and circadian factors. Of course, the circadian factors are that you're hauling boxes on the back side of the clock when you're trying to live with a family that operates on the front side of the clock. So, as you can see, it was a complex accident, but it was an old style of accident that has been going on for decades. The old dive into the terrain, punching through the MDA. They're certainly not the first people to do this sort of accident, and that's kind of the problem with this accident. And that's why we went to vertical guidance, which is much better. And like I said, I got this on my 310, and in fact, I can program my 310 to call out minimums. So because I'm single pilot in that thing, my wife's just an observer. But anyway, a very unfortunate accident. Fatigue was certainly a factor in it, but training proficiency, which is an issue, and I must admit my proficiency level when I was flying in these sort of approaches was not great, just because we simply didn't do them. So it took a lot of preparation and a lot of briefing just to have your act together and to do this approach properly. And of course, once it wasn't working out, it would have been just let's go around and sort this thing out. Hey, we're tired, it's late or early. It's come around, and of course by that time they could have gotten the ILS. So lots of shoulda, woulda, couldas. Unfortunately didn't result. So anyway, long detailed explanation, but it's a simple would appear to be a simple accident that isn't, and it's got a lot of compounding details. So I hope you found it informative. I hope I didn't leave out anything important. We're talking about an extremely detailed report, and there are a lot of little nuances that I didn't go into and discussions and stuff, but I hope I covered the meat of the material, and I'm sure somebody will say, hey, you forgot this point. But anyway, that's the way it works. I hope you enjoyed it, found it informative. Thanks for watching.